Okay, and we are going live now, and we are live.
So good morning, everyone. It's my pleasure today to introduce Danielle Smullen, who is a PhD student in our software engineering program in the School of Computer Science at Carnegie Mellon. Danielle will be presenting his work on informing the design and refinement of privacy and security controls. And I'd like to take this opportunity also to thank the members of his committee, Dr. Lorrie, Dr. Alessandro Acquisti, Dr. Yaxing with the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, and Dr. Rebecca Weiss with Mozilla. Danielle, please go ahead. And I'm going to ask everyone to hold their questions until the end of the presentation, unless there is something that's really not clear and that deserves a correction in the moment. Otherwise, please hang on to your questions and everybody will be given a chance to ask questions at the end. Thank you. Go ahead, Danielle.
All right. Thank you very much for the introduction, Norman. So this dissertation is fundamentally about improving the management of privacy and security controls. So what do we mean by privacy and security then? Well, data privacy has classically been characterized as the claim of individuals, groups, or institutions to determine for themselves when, how, and to what extent information about them is communicated to others. And contextual integrity theory adds that though people's individual preferences vary, they're also highly context dependent. So accommodating diverse personal choices is the important guiding principle under this definition. Whereas in contrast, security focuses on defeating specific threats, and usable security experts have recognized how difficult it is to choose the appropriate settings, advocating to not offer any choices when there's a secure default. Yet privacy advocates promote myriad choices. Now, this doesn't mean that privacy and security conflict. Designing effective privacy and security controls is about finding the right settings to address people's concerns, not the most or the fewest possible options. So most software today has settings which place the burden of configuration on users. So management is important, but not enough attention is being paid to the consequences of this burden. And as privacy and security risks evolve, we may need to offer new or different settings, but they're already too complex and it's getting worse. Therefore, we need to find ways to improve their management. And if there's too many settings, it might be natural to reconsider whether it makes sense to offer privacy and security controls at all. Unfortunately, this is a trivial solution and it can't generalize. People have different concerns, different risk tolerances, and people's confidence in their ability to avoid or mitigate risks can also vary. And given that there's no universally optimal default, privacy and security controls are here to stay. But again, what makes this a hard problem isn't the necessity to offer people different controls. We need to figure out what the right controls are so that they can be effective. All right, so let's get started with tackling the problem. This dissertation is comprised of a succession of 3 technical chapters, each of which is dedicated to a study designed to address part of the problem of improving the management of privacy and security controls, starting with an exploratory study. We begin by looking at web browsers with the aim of assessing how well their settings work for a particular set of people, exploring how they interact with the settings through contextual interviews. And in the second technical chapter, we expand our focus to look at ways in which we can consolidate and standardize the settings in browsers and online generally, making them simpler. We make recommendations based on correlations we observed among crowdsourced preferences to allow or restrict certain data practices in different contexts. And in the third technical chapter, we look at mobile app permissions, where standardization exists, but the settings still aren't good enough. When permissions are extended to incorporate new factors that people care about but can't currently express, the settings would ordinarily become more numerous. But we show that there are effective ways to manage this. So let's take a closer look at the first study, where we looked at the current settings in browsers. We specifically looked for things that seemed to be working well and tried to find areas where the existing settings were falling short. So we can't describe this study without first acknowledging what other researchers have done in this area. And many of these people, in fact, are here right now or have worked with our group in the past. So prior work by Schaub et al. Described the challenges, requirements, and best practices for designing privacy notices. And their work details a variety of design archetypes which provide a framework for describing the interfaces which are presented to users across several different domains. And other work extensively detailed a variety of approaches to creating usable and useful user interfaces for providing choices and obtaining consent and mapping the design space and the choices inherent in different alternatives. These works serve as guidance for best practices, and they explore ways to mitigate risks that we've done in this work. Now, while Schaub and others explored ways to improve the design of awareness and control mechanisms encountered on websites, Bolevikow and others notes the importance of timing and salience on their effectiveness. And prior work from Cranshaw, Wilson, Liu, Lin, and others covered location settings and ways to model preferences in mobile apps, pointing out the importance of limiting complexity. More recent studies by Feng and Konago and others have also explored ways to design mechanisms that can apply to the unique considerations surrounding the heterogeneous Internet of Things. But what's apparent from the literature is that the settings and interfaces that everyday users encounter in the wild would stand to benefit from a clearer understanding of how the controls they offer align with people's mental models. Rao and others studied this mismatch, and Habib and others more recently showed that the ways that different websites offer opt-out choices can vary considerably. Different variations are more effective than others, but the literature suggests that many of the options can be inconsistent, confusing, or difficult to use. And this is the same phenomenon we see again and again in our work, where we focus on how a particular set of users interacts with their browser to make use of the options and interfaces that are provided there. Later in this talk, we'll go into the exploration of how people would ideally prefer to configure these settings across both browsers and websites. But first, we need to go into a little bit more detail about terminology that will be used. So right now, we need to define two key dimensions of privacy and security: awareness and control. In the privacy literature, the terminology which is generally used is notice and choice, but it wasn't enough for us to focus on only these dimensions when looking at both privacy and security at the same time. For users to be able to mitigate both privacy and security risks, they need information about the potential risks and the implications of mitigating or accepting them. So awareness moves beyond choice, specifically understanding the risks which might be present in a scenario, whereas notice is principally about understanding one's options. These definitions come with an inherent concept of usability. A huge wall of text, for example, is unlikely to make users aware of anything. Notice alone, however, can't address the clandestine nature of many contemporary privacy and security risks, nor can it address the potential disconnect between risks and their mitigation strategies. Therefore, we focus on awareness. Now, when we look at control, we move beyond choice, that is, options to express one preference amongst a given fixed set. Control refers to having some authority or ability to influence a given scenario beyond the clear-cut set of available options. And this broader definition is important when we consider scenarios in which the choices offered by a system may be misaligned with the privacy and security risks that they purport to address. And when we look through the lens of control, we have a better way of evaluating situations where people's mental models may poorly align with their immediately obvious options, and we want to make recommendations about what might be more effective. So, do browsers provide their users with adequate awareness and control? Well, studies have shown that people encounter risks online all the time, and it's not clear that people are aware of them or what to do about it. This might be because browsers might not be making potential risks clear enough or offering the right decisions to mitigate them. So this study attempts to answer the following research questions. What do our participants understand about their browser's ability to notify them about data practices and take control? Can our participants even monitor and control the data practices in their browser? And how do they perceive and understand this ability? What browser features appear to be effective or less effective at communicating this information and control? And what improvements can or should be made? We answer these research questions by employing a contextual interview methodology, where participants will interact with their primary browser through a remote screen sharing session with their interviewer, myself, while asked questions about what they think is going on. And we do some tasks together. We ask them to identify the presence of data practices and to restrict them. We analyzed their interviews first by verifying their transcripts, then analyzing the verified transcripts with thematic analysis. At least 2 annotators go through the text to create codes that represent different themes that connect with our research questions. After each round, the annotators reconcile, rinse, and repeat until no new themes seem to emerge. Then, as a final step, we summarize the codes, quantifying instances and co-occurrence of codes. The study also incorporated some important methodological considerations. We needed to make sure that the browsers were all configured in their default configuration without add-ons on the same generic example website. It was crucial that the website minimally influenced people's responses. We also further mitigated ecological validity issues by showing real interactive browsers through the remote screen sharing sessions moderated by the interviewer. The example website also included an example of each of the data practices we studied and were tested to make sure that the browsers capable of detecting them actually did so. But we note that this wasn't always consistent from browser to browser. So these are the data practices we studied, starting with identity and sign-in services like sign-in with Google, targeted advertising, behavioral profiling, fingerprinting, and crypto mining. And for this study, we focused on 5 of today's most popular browsers, and Chrome is the most popular, decreasing somewhat from left to right. Each of these browsers take a different approach to providing awareness and control. So Chrome and Safari offer simpler controls, whereas Firefox and Brave offer fine-grained settings to control a variety of different data practices individually, and Edge is somewhere in the middle. Similarly, Chrome offers very little in the way of notifications, indicators, or descriptions about different data practices. But as we go from left to right, the amount of information seems to increase. Now, this doesn't mean that more is better. We want to know if it's the right information, and the same can be said for controls. But this spectrum is also only a rough abstraction, and it's not always true that these 5 browsers fit perfectly into this ordering. For example, Brave doesn't have a category for crypto mining, yet Firefox does. So let's take a closer look at Chrome, which has simplistic settings, but a ton of add-ons to make up for it. Now, Chrome has actually over 130,000 extensions, but 86% of them have less than 1,000 users, and only 4 out of the top 20 are even relevant to privacy and security. So because many of these add-ons are not directed at regular users to begin with, it seemed to make more sense for them to remain out of scope. So here we see an example of what the generic website looks like in Chrome, but it's always the same website in every browser. What differs is the settings and user interfaces of each browser. And note that here we don't say anything about privacy and security during the interview to avoid priming people. To that end, Chrome has basic privacy and security settings in a menu within the main browser settings. And like all other browsers, Chrome offers a way to manage and block cookies, which can be associated with many data practices. But finally, most browsers also offer HTML5 settings for things like location and camera access, which could potentially be associated with data practices in some specific circumstances. However, I'll reveal now that even though these settings exist in every browser, Chrome users in particular misinterpreted them. They thought that they were applicable more generally to privacy and security, even though they're only tangentially related to the data practices that we covered. Brave, on the other hand, is a browser that's attempting to market itself as privacy promoting. So you can see here that Brave has a special dashboard for privacy and security related settings, and it breaks down different data practices into their own specific categories, like fingerprinting. However, Brave can sometimes misclassify fingerprinting, even though the fingerprinter we added to the example website is definitely on their block list. Unlike fingerprinting, Brave categories crypto mining under the general category of trackers and ads as well. When we look at Brave's browser settings menu, there are also even more settings. Brave uniquely offers settings to control identity services like Google and Facebook and others. Now remember, our study employed a contextual interview methodology, which is great for producing qualitative results, but with the limitation that these findings can't generalize fully. It's impossible for this methodology to produce statistically derived conclusions about the 5 browsers or their populations of users, even though we do have the ability to quantify some things. But with that said, there are interesting qualitative observations we were able to make about different themes that seem to emerge. The interviews were around an hour in length, and throughout this time, we were able to collect and categorize many different patterns of exploration among different participants, for example. We were also able to see trends among the different ways they ran into trouble and became frustrated. So let's take a moment to look at those. Now, it appears at a high level that most people struggled to be aware of data practices and to use their settings to take control. And this trend seemed to also be independent of the browser that people used. But again, we can't say this holds true generally, given that we had 5 interviews per browser. Despite this limitation, it still seemed to be the case that the browsers fell short in giving our participants the information that they needed to complete the interview tasks. It appears they weren't giving people controls or information that made sense to them. For example, after exploration of the settings for a very long time, going through every single menu and option in detail, there were many participants who gave up without success. They assumed that there must be a setting to control the data practices somewhere, but they just couldn't find it. However, the problem was that these settings simply didn't exist, and they could have continued searching and being frustrated forever without finding what they were looking for. There were also several instances where participants became frustrated because they couldn't make sense of the language that their browser used to describe certain settings or data practices, or there was no description at all. So overall, our analysis revealed several themes in the data, but because we have limited time, I'll continue from where we left off on the previous slide and focus on our findings about misleading or missing information. And this theme had two further sub-themes. If you want to read more about the other themes, you can find them in the results section of chapter 3. So the first theme was this one that we called Google search cognitive bias, where essentially participants believed that they could Google search for technical terms, even though they'd never heard of them before or their browser didn't use these terms. So for example, a Chrome user said, well, I'd usually Google them or, try to. Like my old job, there were classes on this to actually go through long explanations on data practices. Another user said, yeah, I would Google it. That's what I'd do. I'd Google the URL and see what people said about it personally. And this was a Brave user referring to the trackers that they encountered. What seems apparent is that browsers might not be giving people sufficient information to find out about the data practices which concern them, and they don't have enough prior knowledge. Now, this might seem obvious to us now, but how would anyone know what to search for if they'd never heard of the data practice before the interview? If their browser never mentions certain terms or uses general categories like trackers and cookies, how would they know where to start searching for clues about more specific kinds of data practices? Without this information, people may be less likely to have awareness of risks or inconsistencies between their expectations and what their browser actually provides. We also saw a general theme where people became confused about the terminology that was used by their browser or which misled them or was confusing. It seemed that some participants couldn't connect the terms in their browser with the definitions we gave them. So for example, a Safari participant said, well, I mean, maybe if it said something about fingerprinting, then I would look into it, what it was. But yeah, I didn't know what it was and there's nothing here about it. An Edge user said, well, I will say it doesn't really seem to be doing anything to stop behavioral profiling, just because I don't see anything explicitly that it's trying to do to stop it right now. But it's not clear if it's doing it too. I would say, honestly, I'm not sure. It would be nice if their labels were a little bit clearer on what exactly the cookies are and what the trackers are. At a high level, when we look at all the experiences that our participants had across all 5 browsers, we could recognize that there may be some common strengths and weaknesses. So with Chrome, the lack of a way to identify and restrict specific practices seemed to cause our participants a lot of frustration. With Safari, most of our participants didn't seem to have enough familiarity with what the privacy and security settings did for them to be able to figure out how to identify cases. The participants claimed that this didn't matter because they, and I quote, blindly trusted Apple. With Edge, it seemed most of our participants couldn't make sense of the descriptions or implications of the protection level settings that Edge offers. They would tell us that they weren't sure what they were doing when they changed the settings. In Firefox, the privacy dashboard seemed to make it easier for our participants to recognize what practices were there. Where this seemed to fall short was when the dashboard used terminology that they incorrectly associated with unrelated practices. And with Brave, most participants were able to figure out what the practices were there without much trouble. But they lost confidence when they reflected on whether the settings would restrict anything. This seemed to be a common problem with crypto mining, perhaps because it didn't have its own category there. So when we look at specific features that seem to make our participants more successful during the interview tasks, or at least seem to be less likely to frustrate them, we found a trend among browsers which divided up data practices into more granular examples. So remember that with Firefox and Brave, there's separate categories for fingerprinting and social media tracking. However, Firefox may potentially have issues with terminology that seemed to frustrate certain participants. The definition for tracking content was seemingly too vague and people were thrown off by it. With Brave, there wasn't a clear description of what trackers and ads really entails. So when some participants went looking for crypto mining, they became frustrated and gave up before they looked inside this more general category. This was probably made worse when Brave would sometimes incorrectly classify fingerprinting in this more general category, even though a separate category already exists. And we saw similar problems in Safari and Edge, which both combine everything into trackers and cookies. Now, because these issues seem to lead our participants to give up on exploration, one possible solution might simply be to break out practices into more specific categories that they can understand. If people have enough to lead them towards more specifics, they might have an easier time navigating the settings and finding the specific things that they're concerned about without becoming overwhelmed. So when Edge, Safari, or Brave use trackers and ads or trackers and cookies, people might not be able to understand how to connect that to practices like behavioral profiling. Firefox is a good example of descriptions that might be seen as inconsistent. But if we were to get rid of broad categories like trackers and cookies, people might be able to relate to the settings better. Our participants had a hard time understanding what these terms really meant, and they have different implications and interpretations for different data practices. Now, a common suggestion that our participants mentioned to us was to offer better documentation. Tutorials might help reinforce the connection between practices and their implications, which could potentially be better than just using more descriptive or consistent language, but this can only go so far. More generally, browsers need to focus on people's actual concerns. So they need to help people understand whether their concerns are addressed by the settings that they've chosen. And finally, it might potentially benefit people if we replace the de facto standard of cookies and trackers with something that's more meaningful, such as the more detailed descriptions that we provided. Now, in this study, we were mainly focused on how our participants understood and were aware of browser settings. We saw that it was difficult for people to complete the tasks that we gave them, and they struggled a lot. It seemed that there were settings that people expected to work or be described differently. Some settings weren't there at all. We discovered a few ways to fix this because we noticed that people seemed to have an easier time configuring settings that were more fine-grained. But it would be great if we could offer these settings everywhere. This begs the question, if we actually did that, would people even bother to use them? We can't say this for sure with interviews, but in the next study, we can find answers by looking at quantitative data. So in the previous study, we focused purely on qualitative information about existing browsers, which limited the generalizability of our findings. But in this study, there's also a qualitative component. However, it's used in service of developing a quantitative survey to collect people's preferences at scale. This way, we can test hypotheses about whether offering different kinds of settings might work better for different people. So let's take a moment to acknowledge the prior work in this area. One common thread going back many years is work which exposes disconnects between users' expectations and what's offered by different solutions. But Zhang and others more recently looked at this in the context of facial recognition and video analytic systems, which are both complex and potentially controversial. Prior studies have evaluated a variety of solutions offered by browser add-ons and extensions, but we focus on what's offered in browsers' unmodified default configurations in the prior study. However, prior studies chronicling historical changes to browser privacy and security awareness mechanisms show that changes over time have been quite subtle, and many browsers and different websites incorporate common design themes. Many of these designs, however, have been shown to have questionable effectiveness, and there's gaps in what's provided between browsers and websites. Browsers can sometimes provide certain indicators and warnings, but these can easily be confused with warnings and indicators found on websites. Other work by Benish and others illustrates that there's a variety of different design trade-offs, and we've already mentioned prior work by Lin and Liu in this area. Some solutions are intended to provide settings that are comprehensive enough to express what people want, but these can be too overwhelming or too technical for the average user, or there simply might be too many of them. And prior work also repeatedly highlights the overwhelming amount of information that needs to be processed by users to understand risks and filter out less essential information. Now, standardized awareness and control mechanisms, such as the nutrition labels Cranor, Kelly, Emamini, and others explored, hold promise as a way of simplifying privacy and security awareness and making risks easier to understand. Acquisti, Alamedi, and others looked at nudges and more personalized notifications. When based around a standard set of data practices, disclosure decisions, and security choices, these have also been shown to be effective. And these approaches can provide ways of drawing attention to, mitigating, and even preventing risks. Now, we've already covered the existing dashboards and streamlined privacy and security settings offered by many browsers. We evaluated the effectiveness of their approaches and found that there were some ways that they fell short. But in this work, we're moving into a broader context. Here, we've surveyed what a large sample of users believe would be satisfactory for them to feel that they're in control. We show that the constraints offered by appropriately standardized settings would have the effect of reducing the burden of configuring settings without compromising their ability to express what people want. So we've established that data practices are everywhere, and they're too difficult to manage. Our participants struggled with this in their browser. So then why not just block them all and call it a day? Unfortunately, this study is going to show you that an all or nothing approach like this probably won't work very well. Sometimes data practices can be seen by people as good. People see benefits to practices like targeted ads because they want to focus on products and services that are relevant to them. And some people see benefits to practices like fingerprinting because they recognize that it may have security implications for them. But sometimes data practices can be seen by people as bad. Not everyone understands that crypto mining, for example, might be useful for them as it's complex and the benefits are not immediately obvious. Or it might be happening without their consent, which makes them very upset. And some people find ads to be far too intrusive and annoying. Beyond how people feel about some of these practices, it also doesn't appear that they'll go away anytime soon without regulatory changes. So again, it's important to recognize that whether a data practice is too intrusive or risky for someone is related to many different factors, such as those that you see here. We can't simply assume that everyone will want to block everything all the time, and harms will occur when people's expectations don't match with their experience. It's important to be able to let people manage their settings, so we need to be a bit cleverer than only offering the trivial solution. That's why in this study, we aim to understand how users prefer to manage their data practices compared to what's currently possible and try to find gaps between the two. And so we looked at these research questions. What are the signals that people rely on to determine whether the practices are being there or blocked? What affordances do people associate with actually doing that enabling or disabling? And are there practices that people do want to allow or block, and subject to what context? And are there practices that people prefer to be known about, and how often, and so on? And does this change depending on what kind of website? So building upon the taxonomy we introduced in the previous study, in this study, we added additional practices. Nag screens, such as please disable your ad blocker, are quite common these days and equally controversial. Session replay is a relatively new approach to collecting detailed enough data about user interactions with online services that just about every action they take can be reconstructed and replayed. Whereas reporting and analytics is more focused on collecting data in service of fixing bugs or measuring site traffic or other similar kinds of data. But before we continue, I need to point out that it was important to describe these practices to people in a way that didn't bias them, according to our own perspective as researchers. Therefore, we used the following terminology, and notably, our study always used neutral language in place of these potentially value-laden terms. So we wanted to see whether people's preferences varied based not only on the category of websites, such as those you see here, but also on the popularity of the website. After all, people might feel very differently about data practices on a shopping or adult website that they were very familiar with, compared to one that they'd likely never seen before. So the study began by defining our taxonomy and then utilizing it to ask people qualitative questions about how they went about recognizing different data practices, how they knew whether they'd successfully allowed or blocked them. And then these findings underwent grounded analysis, where we attempted to organize the findings again into common themes. These themes then informed the design of a large-scale quantitative survey, which elicited people's preferences to allow or block practices in a way that wasn't specific to any one browser. And once we'd collected this large corpus of preferences across different website categories, we then used them to determine whether it might be possible to offer new kinds of settings. But like our first study, we still needed to pay attention to some important methodological considerations. As I mentioned, we needed to ensure that we didn't bias our participants with the language or framing of our questions. We did, however, need to prime them to make sure that everyone was on a level playing field about the definitions of practices and the types of websites we would show them. We also had to ensure that we used randomization to mitigate learning effects that might happen if we ordered the different contextual factors in the same way. And we had a lot of interesting findings in this work, but the specific qualitative findings that we produced fell into the following 6 categories. But because we don't have time to go through all of them, I'm going to focus on just these 2. One thing that was especially interesting was that the majority of participants were able to demonstrate that they understood the risks and benefits of the different data practices quite well. Without even prompting, people were able to recognize things like nag screens could draw their attention to important sites of interest, even if they still found them annoying. And they saw that fingerprinting could potentially be helpful in securing their accounts, which they saw as especially important on financial websites, for example. With that said, there are many sources of confusion for our participants, particularly when it came to ads. One participant said, well, with the ad blocker or script blocker program, I know I'm protected because I don't receive any ads at all. And with the script blocker, I'm pretty sure the website isn't receiving any information from me based off my limited knowledge of the program. Same goes for private browsing, I guess. In other words, this participant seemed to think that they wouldn't be subject to any data practices at all if they didn't see any ads when they browsed. Quantitatively, it was clear that most people wanted to deny the practices we studied in most circumstances. You can see that practices like fingerprinting are slightly less strong of a majority, however, and this is important. I already mentioned that some participants saw benefits to certain practices in certain situations. So let's take a closer look at that. We saw in our first study that there were many settings that people expected to exist, but seems to be missing or were ineffective. We saw something similar here as well. However, rather than being limited to what browsers currently offer, we wanted to see what would happen if settings to control all the different data practices were also available everywhere. As we did this, we wanted to see correlations in the kinds of preferences that people had among different contexts. And this led us to believe that we might be able to make them simpler and more consolidated. We'll go over these practices and what they mean in a moment, but to explain how we found them, we first need to explain how we took our measurements. So the first measure is accuracy, which we define as in what percentage of scenarios do the settings enable users to align the practices that they're subjected to with their preferences. The second measure is user burden, which we define as how many individual settings need to be changed for the user to get the settings that they want. And we note that the maximum user burden is determined by the number of websites that we surveyed, which was 16 different websites across 8 different categories. So based on our large-scale corpus of preferences to allow or restrict these different data practices among different kinds of websites, we were able to see how different types of settings would enable people to get their preferred outcome to allow or restrict each practice. So when we look at no toggle settings, which allow practices by default without offering a way to change them further, we can get an idea of what's currently offered by Chrome. Now recall that because most people wanted to opt out of the practices most of the time, you can see that the proportion of scenarios that enables people to get what they want here is quite low. But when we move on to the same model, but denying practices by default, we can get an idea of what's offered in most browsers' strict mode. Here, the percentage of scenarios where people get what they want is much higher, but the percentage is still a bit mediocre because there are no further options. If we want to go further, we can take a closer look at settings which don't currently exist in any browser, such as category toggles. These settings would allow us to explore what might happen if browsers offered settings for these data practices based on categories of websites. Clearly, in these scenarios, there's a big improvement, as people can turn the practices on or off, depending on how they feel about them in a particular category. Finally, if we looked at what would happen if every website offered all the settings, we can see that this is the only scenario in which we're able to achieve 100% accuracy. But this is because the settings which can be changed in every possible scenario, so people can freely align their settings however they choose. The problem with this approach, however, is that while it might give people what they want, it comes at the cost of having to configure these settings. So let's take a look at what that means. For each setting that can be changed, there's a cost in user burden, which is the number of individual settings that need to be interacted with for users to accurately capture their preferences. We consider the default to have 0 burden because you wouldn't need to change any of the settings to get this. But as we explore the other alternative settings and defaults, it quickly became apparent that when allow by default settings are used, people would have to change more settings in order to get their preferred settings. The settings which were denied by default were consistently less burdensome in contrast. Now, this doesn't tell the whole picture, however, as we need to go back for a moment and consider the level of accuracy that can be achieved based on these different models. So when we look at no toggle deny by default settings that don't have any further options, the accuracy improves versus the allow by default no toggle, but we are only able to get the settings right around 75% of the time. At the other extreme end of the spectrum, if individual website toggles were offered for every single setting, there are much higher levels of user burden. But there seems to be a potentially good solution when we look at category toggles with deny by default settings. These settings have a very low level of user burden, yet we're able to achieve 92% accuracy on average. This is a huge improvement over the more simplistic settings that don't offer additional options. But in contrast to the website toggles, which might be offering too many options, we found a way to consolidate the settings into more meaningful ones that require less effort to configure. Now, side by side, we can see that one-size-fits-all settings are simple, but their accuracy is poor. A huge array of individual settings has the opposite problem, the best accuracy, but the worst user burden. Consolidated settings based on website categories strike the best balance between high accuracy, but with only a small increase in burden. So if we summarize the key findings of the study, we can see that individual website settings would give people the ability to accurately capture their preferences, but there's too many of them to reconfigure, especially if they're allowed by default. It's unlikely that people would meaningfully engage with these kinds of settings, even if they were more capable of giving people what they want. Now, in contrast, we found that deny by default settings are less burdensome no matter what kind of settings are offered. This is the kind of default that privacy and security experts would recommend. And this may seem a bit obvious, but these settings are not what's typically offered. If we want to make the settings better, we can simplify them by consolidating them based on website categories. This way, there are far fewer settings that would need to be configured, and the settings align well with people's mental models. As a result, they retain very high accuracy, even if they aren't 100% accurate in every possible scenario. Now, based on the observed correlations between preferences and website categories, we may have an opportunity to standardize the settings. If we employ a standard taxonomy of website categories and data practices, we can potentially automate the configuration of settings as people browse between websites within the same category. While our findings sound very optimistic, there are other issues at play here surrounding website breakage and misaligned incentives. We've recognized that websites and browsers offer a patchwork of different options and defaults. And if they were standardized, we could configure them in a single place, like the browser. This would be much easier, and the settings could be applied by browsers automatically. But there's a catch. Standards-based approaches in the past, such as do not track, which was a purely voluntary standard, have not caught on. The problem comes from the fact that browsers, websites, and users all have different incentives. Website operators might rely on data practices which users and browsers deem impermissible and want to restrict. When this happens, websites can potentially force users into a situation where they can't achieve their desired settings because the website just breaks when they try to configure them. Now, while we recognize that APIs to permit the automatic enforcement of settings would be a necessity for our alternative settings to work, if we want websites to actually offer these APIs, we need to have standards that websites will comply with. If we don't, then users will just end up paying the price. Therefore, standards may potentially need to be further supported by regulation, which would serve the purpose of realigning incentive structures that are currently mismatched. So recapping this study, we see that people have different levels of appreciation for the risks and benefits of different data practices. And this seems to be the case even if people don't fully understand all the technical details. And these varying preferences to tolerate or mitigate risks lead to relationships between preferences to opt out and different practices, as well as different types of websites. It's clear that one-size-fits-all preferences are unlikely to work for everyone, as we saw that even deny by default settings with no additional options can only provide people with the settings that they want in around 75% of circumstances. But people want to opt out, and they run into situations where they assume that the settings that they desire are out there somewhere, but they can't find them, they give up, and they get frustrated. We also see that people want to find out about what kinds of data practices they encounter because they're concerned about them. The problem is that they get easily misled by the things that they see when they're browsing. We've already showed that browsers themselves might not be helping enough. But here we see that independent of browsers, people can misinterpret things like ads. What this amounts to is a misalignment between the control that people expect and what they're able to practically achieve. But settings which are consolidated based on the correlations seen among different website categories appear to be a viable option to make configuration easier and standard. We also can see that the settings are capable of being less burdensome than offering every possible option, while still giving people what they want more than 90% of the time. So standardization and consolidation seems to be a useful approach, but it has limits. If we want to test these limits, we can't do that with browsers because they don't already incorporate these standards or APIs, and neither do websites. However, there is an opportunity if we look more closely at mobile app permissions. While they're not fully standardized, mobile app permissions provide a standard way of moderating whether apps have access to sensitive APIs and data. They provide a uniform interface to control permissions for all your apps in one place, which is something that doesn't exist for browsers. And in principle, apps can't access permissions unless they're authorized by the user via the operating system, which allows users to restrict or deny access when apps act for the first time. Now, I'll forgive you if you've been staring at your phone during my talk, because if you have, then you'll realize that you probably have dozens of apps or more on your phone, maybe even hundreds. And that's a lot of permissions to configure. But even these settings might not accurately capture your true preferences to allow or deny access to data accurately enough. So for example, I would much prefer to allow an app access to my contacts so that I can talk to my friends, but I'd rather avoid sharing that information if it'll be used for marketing. We need to figure out how to incorporate these factors without making the settings worse. So this study is the final technical chapter, and you can refer to chapter 5 for more detailed information. Now, as I mentioned a moment ago, one of the biggest challenges in offering effective awareness and control mechanisms is to reduce the burden that they place on users. Now, standardization is already present in mobile app permissions, yet they face many of the same challenges of balancing the ability to provide enough options for people to get what they want against the user burden associated with expressing these preferences. And some prior work proposes to reduce this burden through alternative interaction designs. So some of these involve users negotiating with systems to balance competing interests or competing semantics, or even dynamically granting permissions as the circumstances evolve. But the most promising approaches to mitigate user burden employ machine learning. These approaches ease the burden on users by either performing configuration automatically or can offer recommendations based on profiles which limit the number of manual decisions required to configure the settings. These recommendations can help people configure their settings by homing in on the most important settings that are associated with the greatest differences among different archetypes of users. Now, in our work, we show that machine learning has the capability of not only simplifying the configuration of existing mobile app permissions, but can further ease the burden of more complex permissions models that incorporate factors that the existing settings don't support. And we focus on the purpose for which an app requests permissions, but we also tested other factors as well. So this all comes down to the fact that users are expected to make an increasingly unrealistic number of privacy and security decisions, whether it's on the web or even in your car or on your phone. App permissions such as those you see on the right side of the screen are everywhere, and most people have gotten used to configuring them when they install new apps. But it's painful enough as it is without adding more settings. So even though study after study shows that people care about their privacy and security in principle, people will not engage with endless arrays of settings. As soon as they find it too burdensome, they'll give up and they'll click on anything they believe will get rid of the annoyance. What people care about is getting things done, and they really don't care about configuring their settings. Yet somehow users are expected to configure every single one of them. This isn't going to work. How do we reconcile the fact that preferences are complex, including being purpose dependent, and even without purpose, the number of settings is already unrealistically high? Well, when we reflect on the findings of our prior studies, we could see that there were correlations between different data practices, which are analogous to app permissions, and different website categories, which are analogous to app categories. Now, since these are based on a fixed taxonomy within mobile app ecosystems, perhaps there's an opportunity to use machine learning to take advantage of this somehow. As we've discussed, machine learning models have been used to make predictions about people's preferences. And I'll note that this kind of machine learning doesn't necessarily mean fully automating decisions, but instead providing recommendations that people can accept or change. This has already been shown to work quite well, but what has not yet been shown is whether moving towards models that can include new and more complex factors, such as purpose, would work even better. On paper, there'll be even more settings, and finer grained settings have a larger configuration space. However, we show that machine learning makes up for this because it can take advantage of the predictive power of the complex information within this space. This may present an opportunity to shift the increase in configuration burden away from the user. So therefore, we focused on three main research questions in this machine learning study, which you can see here, but I want to really focus on the third question. Can we make better predictions without increasing user burden? So how does the machine learning approach we used work in practice? Well, first, we collect large corpora of settings to allow or deny permissions across many different apps from many different users. Then next, we cluster users using unsupervised machine learning techniques. This allows us to put users with similar preferences into the same cluster, and we can decide the number of clusters that we want to use. And then within each of these clusters, as the consensus is collected about which settings to recommend to these like-minded individuals, the resulting sets of recommendations are called profiles. And the process of mapping an unknown individual to a cluster is based on supervised machine learning techniques. We limited our approach to these simpler machine learning models because they're more explainable. Unlike deep learning or other types of machine learning models, with this approach, we can vary the number of clusters and visualize recommendations within different clusters to see what kind of settings would be likely for many types of users with diverse preferences. We can also precisely capture the questions and answers that would lead to an individual to be included in one profile versus another. It may be possible to have even stronger results with more personalized machine learning models, but this is future work. So the methodology for the study can be broken down into 3 phases. First, we surveyed a large number of Android users, then mined that data, and then finally built and evaluated machine learning models. We tested these models at different hyperparameter configurations, and we noted the effect on accuracy and user burden like we did in our second study. And on the left, you can see what the survey questions looked like. We made nearly 6,000 observations of preferences about 3 different app permissions within a corpus of 108 apps across every category in the Play Store, and we had nearly 1,000 participants. Next, we analyzed the patterns and responses with regression modeling. We were looking for factors that explain differences in people's likelihood to allow or deny different permissions. And as you can see in this list, there were many that were useful predictors. But importantly, we focus on the purpose for granting the permission, which was a significant differentiator. Based on these correlations, we trained and analyzed machine learning-based profiles. And you can see that we tested different values of K from 2 to 40, representing the number of clusters people are organized into. And the graph on the right shows with the red line how many questions were required to organize people into these profiles. The blue line represents the number of additional questions that would need to be asked when the profiles couldn't make good enough recommendations. And the yellow line is the sum. Across every parameter from 2 to 40 in the top graph, representing the model which incorporates specific purposes, it performed better. In contrast, the model which didn't have the purpose required more questions. This is because the model with purpose doesn't need to ask as many questions because it had better predictive power. Now, when we look at the scatter plot, which maps accuracy against the average number of user interactions, an even clearer picture emerges. We can see that the yellow highlighted area with profiles that support specific purposes require fewer user interactions on average, while maintaining a high degree of accuracy. In contrast, the blue highlighted area with profiles that don't incorporate purpose require many more user interactions. Now, even though the graph suggests that they may be capable of the highest overall accuracy, if you look at the top right, these outliers are probably unrealistic. Even 30 or 35 interactions is likely to push most people's limits, let alone 50 or 60. So it doesn't really matter what the graph shows beyond the much smaller threshold. Now, for reference, let's briefly compare that to what's expected of users that aren't assisted by machine learning. It would have been nice to simulate user interactions in this real-world context, but it's not clear that this would be very meaningful. Even a simplistic example constrained to 36 apps with only 3 permissions, each subject to 3 purposes, that's 324 interactions. I think this goes without saying it's unrealistic, but more importantly, it shows that the promise of machine learning holds to make management easier. Yet when we contrast permissions with purposes versus permissions without purposes, we can see that the more complex model is both capable of higher accuracy and fewer overall user interactions for many values of K, and you can tune the model accordingly. So let's drill down into the meaning of these findings a little bit more. The whole aim of this study was to make it possible to provide people with settings that better reflect their mental models and preferences. In the case of this work, we saw that the purpose for granting permissions was a missing factor, as did prior work. Hypothetically, if people could express their preferences more accurately, if it were possible to capture this factor. Ordinarily, this would become more burdensome, but machine learning takes advantage of the added predictive power. Thus, recommendations which more accurately reflect people's preferences can in fact also make configuration easier. People rely less on having to manually configure their settings, and less interactions are required. But importantly, our approach need not take away control or autonomy from users in order to achieve this. Recommendations can be accepted or rejected by people as they please. Rather than having to configure every setting, we can focus on the ones that are empirically observed to be the most significant and make smarter recommendations about the rest. So let's take a moment to recap. Mobile app permissions are standard, so in principle, they're like the standard types of settings that we recommended for browsers. The problem remains that they still aren't expressive enough, but there's too many of them to manage. If we want to make them more expressive, then they should include factors like purpose, which have been shown to make a difference in how people would prefer to configure their settings. However, if we naively introduce these additional settings, there'll be an explosion of new settings. This isn't going to work. The solution we offer comes from the observation that factors such as purpose can increase the predictive power of machine learning models. This enables the machine learning models to make more accurate recommendations more often, which in turn reduces the number of user interactions required. We can make the model smarter so that we don't have to default back to asking the user as often. And added factors more accurately capture what people want. But the cost of achieving these more accurate settings is diminished because the amount of burdensome user interactions needed to provide these settings is also reduced. When we get both higher accuracy and lower user burden, the trade-off between the two has been successfully mitigated. Okay, so what have we learned from all this work? Well, let's look at the trend that seems to follow from the 3 studies that I covered today. The first trend is that browsers and mobile app permissions need improvement because even though they each offer a different approach to awareness and control, none of them seem to adequately address people's needs. In the case of browsers, people struggle to figure out what data practices they're subject to, and they can't figure out what settings are needed to restrict them. Maybe clearer language and more consistent settings would help, but simply offering more settings doesn't necessarily translate to better or more usable settings. If we try to accommodate all the different interpretations of data practices, permissions, categories of websites, categories of apps, and so on and so forth, people will simply give up because the configuration will take far too much effort. And this leads to unmitigated risks and unmet expectations. Now, in this work, we've also identified effective ways to make configuration easier. One approach is through standardization, such as what we recommend for browsers, which would in principle make their settings more closely aligned with mobile app permissions. Well, we saw that when we analyzed people's preferences about restricting data practices, people generally wanted to restrict them, but it's not enough to simply restrict them everywhere. What would work much better is to take advantage of the correlations between categories of practices and types of websites, and using this information to consolidate the settings. A standard interface with consistent descriptions of practices and website categories would probably help even more, but this isn't going to be achievable unless we can get everyone to agree on standards. However, that approach can only go so far. And as we observed with mobile app permissions, it may be the case that adding more complexity to the settings is unavoidable. Fortunately, that isn't where the story ends. Machine learning turns out to be an effective strategy to mitigate trade-offs between accuracy and user burden. What we saw was that even though mobile app permissions couldn't provide people with the options that would most accurately capture their preferences, we could make it possible to offer these settings without requiring users to suffer the burden of configuring them unassisted. It's important to recognize that the fact that these app permissions are standardized plays a role in enabling the use of machine learning, because we can rely on having a limited number of classes for app categories, permissions, and so on, within which to make predictions and recommendations. Yet there are other important requirements to consider as well. Fundamentally, if the settings which are offered to users are well aligned with their mental models, we can take advantage of machine learning's ability to leverage the strong predictive power within these models. This is what enables them to make smart recommendations, which help alleviate user burden, rather than simply forcing people through the gauntlet of settings. However, if the settings which are offered do not align with people's mental models, the greater complexity and finer granularity will only serve to make the problem worse. This will cost users even more in the form of even greater user burden. So at a high level, this work suggests that there are 3 main methodologies that might be helpful to improve privacy and security generally. User studies can help us understand what people know or don't know, and we can check to what extent they're able to take advantage of the settings or notifications we provide them. We can also collect corpora of people's preferences to identify more usable settings, which strike a good balance between accuracy and user burden. But we can further reduce user burden using machine learning, generating recommendations that simplify the decisions that people have to make. So before we talk about potential avenues for future work, I just want to give a few final thoughts. One thing that's become apparent throughout this work is that privacy and security settings are not going to stay the same forever. What's also clear is that they aren't working well enough, and proliferation isn't likely to help. Fortunately, we show that there are at least a few ways which can make the settings more effective. We can make settings more effective by making them more manageable, by better aligning them with people's mental models, or by making them more comprehensively address people's concerns, and by making them more accurately capture people's preferences. Our recommendations are going to rely heavily on regulations, which will be needed to help normalize and standardize what's offered to users and enable people's settings to be automatically enforced. Automation can also take the form of machine learning, which can help people manage their settings more easily, even if the settings are more complex. With these recommendations, we can empower users with greater levels of awareness and more control, and this should help them mitigate new kinds of privacy and security risks as they emerge. So what are these future risks going to look like? Well, no one can say for sure. But what is clear is that despite the extent of the work I presented today, there is still a huge frontier of future work left to explore. And I'd like to take a moment to mention a few of these avenues and point out how methodologies that were employed in this work could potentially be adapted for use in answering these new questions. First, it would be a good idea to take a closer look at the different ways of organizing privacy and security concepts. In this work, we relied on a limited number of contextual factors, and we extended mobile app permissions with purposes, but it's possible that there are other ways of organizing settings that even better align with people's mental models. We can still do contextual interviews, and we can still run large-scale surveys, but the difference would be that we can base these study designs around different definitions with different framing. We should also see whether these alternatives can be consolidated and incrementally improved further. In fact, it's likely that as technologies continue to evolve, it will be necessary to update these definitions accordingly. This makes it important to address the second area of future work, which is with a longitudinal component. If we're going to understand how people's preferences evolve, we will need to adapt the methodologies that were used in this work to repeatedly capture data over time. Interviews could have a follow-up stage, and surveys which elicit people's preferences can be administered at regular intervals. But by measuring the differences, it may be possible to see patterns which can't be observed at only one point in time. We can also iterate upon our designs over time. And perhaps these designs can incorporate new modes of interaction, which is the third area of future work. It may be possible for more personalized machine learning models to perform even better than the profile-based models that we studied. Models which rely on large amounts of training data, such as deep learning, might reveal ways to make recommendations for larger numbers of settings. But rather than shifting the burden entirely to machine learning, there may be the potential for models which involve conversation and negotiation, ensuring that the users can retain their autonomy. It will be important for these models to be explainable, however, so that people can understand the reasons for the recommendations. Regardless of the specific approach, there are new machine learning strategies being developed every day, and so the field is ripe with possibilities. But for now, I hope that I've inspired some confidence that it's possible for things to move in a more positive direction. Armed with better data and improved standards and stronger regulations and more capable tools or techniques, there's a lot of reasons to be optimistic about what the future will offer to help us meaningfully assert our privacy and our security. So this concludes my prepared remarks, and I'd like to hand control back to Norman. But first, I'd like to thank everyone for their attention, and special thanks to my committee.
Thank you, Danielle. Big round of applause. Thank you. So we are on time, and this is where everyone gets a chance to ask questions. I usually start with members of the committee, and because they typically have put more of an effort in joining us, I like to start with the external members of the committee first. So I'd like to either ask Yaxing or Rebecca perhaps to jump in with any questions that they might have. No need to provide feedback at this stage. We'll discuss among ourselves what the feedback might be and what the ultimate decision is. But you're obviously welcome to suggest some feedback as part of your questions if you want to. So, Rebecca, would you like to go first? Or Yaxing?
Yeah, sure, I can go first. Great work, Daniel, and great presentation.
Thank you.
So there are a lot of interesting results there. So I have a question about in the section of study 1, study 2. So in the first study, you showed that basically people's experiences can be very different among different browsers due to the settings and all the interface and all those things. In the second study, however, you're trying to eliminate the impact of browser on how users configure their settings against data practices and focus more on the context and website. I wonder, do you have any insights on how users' browser experiences may influence their preferences of settings against data practices, especially when you consider there's some users who are exclusively only use like one browser, like if you only use Safari, they probably tend to believe that Safari provides a better protection, and that might influence their ways of their preferences of how they would configure these practices.
Yeah, so that's a very good question. So to kind of summarize it, I think what you're saying is, in the first study, we focused on the browser itself independent of the context of websites. Mm-hmm. And then in the second study, we did the opposite, right? Mm-hmm. And that's true. However, with that said, the qualitative data that we collected as part of the second study did include some interesting data about different browsers as well. And the quantitative data also collected demographic information, which included the user's primary browser. And what we saw here was that people's preferences did not seem to strongly correlate with the browser that they used. It much, much more strongly correlated with the type of website. So I think what this seems to suggest is potentially that maybe browsers have some influence on people's preferences, but it's not strong enough for us to measure a significant difference in whether they would allow or deny these preferences subject to these practices rather, subject to the context of these different websites. But naturally, this is something that can be studied further in more detail.
Okay, all right, thank you. Okay, so I have another quick question before I hand on to Rebecca. So you talk about standardization a lot. I think I have kind of two things here. The first thing is, so you talk about, in the document, talk about standardization from browser level and also something related to the website API. But it's still like, I kind of have my understanding of your argument for standardization is still a little fuzzy. I'm trying to see, can you give a concrete example or kind of user flow, considering, for example, myself as a general user, like in an ideal world where like standardization is in place, what will be the online experience look like for me as a user?
Right. So let me begin by giving you sort of a counterexample of what I hope it will not look like. So if all the settings to control all those different data practices were offered uniformly everywhere and every single website had the ability to allow you to turn them on and off, which right now is not possible, then as people go from website to website, they're going to have to reconfigure these settings constantly. And I think that, something that serves as an example of how this is annoying and burdensome is what people often see when they're asked to configure settings that are offered ostensibly to comply with GDPR. People see them everywhere. There's pop-ups that appear saying, do you accept all the cookies? And, this kind of cookie or that kind of cookie, or for this purpose and that purpose, and so on and so forth. And so this massive array of settings is not likely to allow people to express their preferences meaningfully because they see this huge array and they just want to get rid of it. So they just click past it and they're not actually giving the website the preferences that they would prefer. Now, in contrast, if the standardization that I propose was in place, then rather than offering these as a user interface that everybody would have to interact with on every individual website, browsers themselves could offer a single settings menu where you could configure these preferences across different categories of websites. And as you go to these different categories of websites, the APIs that would exist on both the websites and supported by the browser would speak to one another and allow those preferences to be configured automatically. So this would have the effect of allowing people to configure a minimal set of preferences that would then extend and generalize to all different websites based on what category they're on. And so we've shown with the empirical data that we've collected that this is likely to capture most people's preferences most of the time.
Okay. All right, great. Thank you. So yeah, I'll pass it on to Rebecca. I'm good for now.
Thank you.
Rebecca, we can't hear you. You need to unmute yourself. And go ahead.
Okay, how about now? Yes?
Yep.
Great.
Okay, great. Excellent. Thank you for bearing with me because I'm on my phone. Okay, so I had two questions, but they're kind of all broadly related to the same general area, which is throughout the studies that you showed us, you're kind of operating under this idea that I can ask a person about their preferences, and that's the kind of formal mental model that they have, and that's the true model, that's their true set of preferences. And I'm reminded of how in public opinion research, there's always this problem of non-attitudes where people don't really have an opinion until you actually ask them. And then the stability of that attitude over time is usually not certain. So you touch about this a little bit actually in your conclusions and your follow-up work. And so this question is really just to ask you to explore that a little bit further here. And mostly, how do you imagine designing some form of protocol to evaluate whether someone's stated preferences remain stable over time as their actual behavior? A little bit of exploration about how you're thinking about that.
Yeah, so I think that, as I mentioned, there has to be a longitudinal component here, right? So, we can observe all sorts of correlations between different people's preferences and, different factors at a single point in time. But it's going to require us to remeasure those preferences over intervals in order to see whether they evolve and how they evolve. And that's a question that hasn't really been clearly answered by the literature at this time, though there have been several studies that do evaluate this. For example, one of the studies that I worked on with Peter Story was one where we evaluated people's attitudes and security choices over time. But this is separate, right? This doesn't necessarily apply to people's preferences. But what's clear is that people's preferences don't always just stay the same. So I think it's important for us to design a methodology where we can do things like run these surveys at scale, where we collect these preferences from potentially thousands of different users, such that we can get a sample which generalizes fairly well, and where we can also see how these preferences change between these regular intervals. And so another thing to consider when doing so is that it may not be enough necessarily to simply do it every week or every month. We also need to take into context the influence of events that happen in the media and so on. It may be the case that these have a very powerful influence on people's preferences, and revelations about surveillance and so on and so forth might lead people to have much stronger preferences, or other people to feel potentially more resigned, but we just don't know. So that's a study that will have to be done, and it's important to do this over time.
Rebecca, does this answer your question, or do you want to follow up on that?
Sorry.
Okay, it sounds like Rebecca has some technical issues here. We can definitely hear the engine and the wind as you drive, Rebecca, but we cannot hear your voice right now.
Rebecca's entered into the chat to please continue on.
Okay, all right. So let me potentially ask a quick follow-up question to Rebecca's question, Danielle. Hopefully I'm sort of going to do a reasonable job at channeling, I think, where she was trying to get. So she was talking about the fact that, people don't necessarily know how they feel about these issues until you ask them the question. And I interpreted that also as, potential limitation of the work that has been done here, in the sense that all your studies were basically conducted in a context that was not necessarily the actual context of use. And so it's always possible that within that, actual context, you might potentially get slightly different responses. I'm just going to sort of jump, maybe this is a comment more than a question, but you might want to more clearly acknowledge that it's always possible that, had you conducted this, in the actual context, and you got close to the actual context, but not all the way, you might have potentially seen slightly different questions, and we don't know the answer to this issue.
Yeah, that's right. Actually, I would like to briefly remark on that. So the first study, I think, is the one that you're alluding to that probably most closely resembles the actual context. However, it does also differ from the realistic context in that many people, remarked in their interviews that they'd never really looked through these settings in the depth that they did during the actual process. And so I think that this is actually a very important revelation, however, because if people aren't looking at their settings and they're not developing impressions about what their preferences are, then it means that we may not have people, able to ever really articulate their preferences because they just simply haven't been exposed to the opportunity to express them. So while that is a limitation of this work, it also means that it's something that, could potentially be done better by browsers as well.
So perhaps this is the right time to ask our other committee members to jump in, and this might, be close to some of the questions they might have. So I don't know who wants to follow, Lorrie or Alessandro.
I can go ahead.
Go ahead,
First, just a quick curiosity. Where do these research papers stand as far as publication? Are some of these published, or are they in the pipeline, or?
Yeah, so the papers that came about as a result of the second and third chapter have already been published. The one that's representing the first chapter is going to be submitted to PETS in November. That's the plan.
Okay, Awesome.
And the other two chapters have been published at PETS also.
That's right. Yeah,
They're
that's
both
right.
at
They're both
PETS.
published
Yeah.
at PETS.
Yeah.
Reasonable publication.
Yeah, you should add a footnote on the beginning of each chapter saying that. Very cool. All right, so I'm wondering about this preference towards different categories of websites. And you observed that people may, for example, want to allow more tracking and stuff on banking websites because it helps them log in and things like that. So have you considered that maybe there's a different way to slice it? Instead of slicing it by category, it's by functionality. That, you know, that trackers that allow me to log in, I'll allow, but not others.
Absolutely, yeah. So that's something that's somewhat more alluded to in the third study than in the second study, where we focus on the contextual factor of purpose, right? So I think that purpose might potentially be analogous to functionality depending on how you define purpose. But in the case of that study, we separated between different purposes like advertising and purposes like it's actually essential to the functionality of the application to, you know, to allow this permission. But that is certainly something that could also be studied in the context of browsers and websites as well. In fact, there's potentially many different ways that it can be sliced. So I think an important area of future work is to recognize that there may be alternative taxonomies or additional contextual factors that will need to be studied in order to make more definitive conclusions about them.
Yeah, and have you looked at Ghostery as an example of a plugin that does, they have their own way of slicing things, and they do have a sense of purposes that I guess they've manually compiled. Have you taken a look at that, and what do you think of their approach? Yeah,
now I have personally taken a look at it, but I have not done like a systematic analysis of it. As I mentioned, for the first study, we explicitly put add-ons out of scope. And so with that said, you know, my sort of remarks about Ghostery is that while it's a very interesting tool, I think that, you know, a systematic study potentially like the one that was done for, you know, that first study could also be performed on this. And there have been prior studies that have done, you know, systematic evaluations of add-ons. So, you know, those definitely need to be acknowledged. But that was mostly out of scope for this particular study. We really wanted to focus on what was available in browsers themselves.
Okay. So another, you know, hypothesis that you could have is that users basically want to have the most privacy that they can get as long as things don't break.
Potentially, yeah.
So why not just configure browsers that way?
That is a very excellent question. And that was something that we discussed at length with Mozilla during the design of the second study. But there's a really big problem with that. It's extremely difficult to determine whether or not a website is actually broken. And this comes from many different reasons. So first, if you're going to sort of mechanically determine whether a website is broken, that doesn't necessarily mean that just, you know, because there's JavaScript errors or whatever, for example, that a user would actually perceive it to be broken. And so there's this disconnect between the mechanisms that you can use to determine brokenness or the degree of brokenness or whatever, and people's actual perceptions. Now, if you focus solely on people's perceptions, that's also equally fraught because people might not realize the extent of the functionality that they're actually missing. So it may well be the case that you could design a study that focuses solely on people's perceptions and then uses that to determine whether or not the website was, you know, functional enough. But this is certainly an area of future study that's going to require a lot of very careful thought about how you measure brokenness and measure users' perceptions and, you know, determine whether these measures can generalize well. And I think that's part of the reason why there aren't that many studies of this kind, but they do exist. And so it's important to recognize that that's not an area that's totally, you know, uncharted.
So now I have another hypothesis, which is that my first one was wrong. So let's assume we can solve the technical problems and we can determine brokenness. Another hypothesis is that actually won't satisfy everyone. And I base this in part on a study that was in my student Hannah's thesis, not yet published, on Facebook ad preferences. And she interviewed people about what kinds of controls they wanted. And she found that there were some people who indeed wanted the most privacy possible, and there were some people who just didn't care. But there were some people who their goal was actually to get better tailored ads that they'd be more interested in. And so for people like that, actually, they don't want to just block everything. You know, there are certain things that they would allow. So how do we deal with that group?
Yeah, so I think that that's a finding that definitely triangulates with the findings from the second study that I performed. And in fact, one of the websites that we asked people about in the social media category was Facebook. So it seems to be the case that, you know, of course, the website category matters here. And so you may see different answers to this question, depending on whether it's a different website. But I guess the main point is that some people do indeed derive, you know, some positive impressions from these practices. And so we can't just assume that we should block them everywhere. So I think one way that we can address this issue is by looking at that context. But another one is by looking at the practice itself. And another is, again, by doing future work to explore whether these other contextual factors are ones that are differentiators in terms of whether people wish to allow or deny these practices. But I think the main thing that we needed to focus on in this work was measuring the sort of manageability against the ability to more accurately captures people's preferences. And so we can use different definitions of accuracy, as I think you're suggesting here. But again, you know, we have to be able to sort of systematically analyze both of these. And just by offering people more options in order to get them to potentially, you know, be able to express something that's closer to what they want, it may be the case that we're offering so many settings when we do that, that then, you know, we've sort of thrown the baby out with the bathwater, and people aren't able to meaningfully express their preferences anymore. So I think in order to accommodate the most diverse preferences, it's really crucial to look at both of these angles. And again, I think that what you've mentioned in Hannah's study triangulates very well with what we saw in the second study, but there's still much more work that could be done there too.
Great. I'll pass it on to Alessandro.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Alessandro.
Yeah, thank you. So, Daniel, again, congratulations both on the work you've done and on the presentation. Before I get to some questions, I wanted to really praise you for especially the first part of the presentation. I really like how you went through the related literature, citing all these different papers. Sometimes presentations go too quickly through that part. I believe building upon prior work is critical. And you presented a very neat summary of the space of work in this area. I really enjoyed it. Yeah. I will focus my questions on what I believe is chapter 3, essentially your first study, because it's the latest one added to the dissertation.
Yep.
And I'll go from narrow to bigger picture. The first and super narrow question was, you mentioned that you wanted your users, the browsers or your participants, to be in default configuration. How did you know that was the case?
So are you talking about whether people generally use that default configuration, or how did I guarantee that they were exposed to the default?
The latter, assuming that I understood correctly what you were saying in your slide. It seemed to me that you were implying that you wanted users to be straight out of the box users of the browser.
Yeah, so actually it was very easy for me to do this. Basically, I had a machine that was dedicated to running the browser on, which would host the remote screen sharing session. And the user profile and the state of that system was wiped and refreshed with the same exact image every single time between every participant. So, you know, participants, with Brave would get the Brave browser, and with Edge would get the Edge browser, and so on. But they would always start at the same exact state.
Okay, makes sense. Then, but then connecting this to a somewhat related, not identical, but somewhat related question, Yaxing was asking you just at the very start. Do you think that this approach, which is absolutely sensible and defensible, may create some bias in that some of your users may have been adept and in fact habituated to the default configuration and some not. So you basically presented a system that may not match what the users were habituated to, or in some cases may. And could this affect your analysis?
That's an excellent question. But fortunately, I have some data, at least with respect to Firefox, where we show that greater than 95% of users don't actually modify the browser beyond its default configuration, though with that said, that may not extend to add-ons. So I think that is one of the limitations of this study, where we specifically put add-ons out of scope. But as I pointed out during the presentation, Chrome ostensibly relies on many add-ons in order for people to get the ability to configure, whether to allow or restrict certain data practices. So this is a definite limitation. It is entirely possible that Chrome users would have a somewhat different experience if their browser was equipped with all of the add-ons that they were used to. With that said, not every one of our participants mentioned that they used an add-on, although some did, and those findings are reported inside the dissertation. But I think importantly, we need to control for the variability that this can provide, because if the browser settings are already very difficult to manage and for people to understand, then when we add an extra layer of complexity on top of this, with people having to manage the configuration of their add-ons as well, then things can get even more complex and more far afield. Mm-hmm. So I think we need to start with just the browser itself, and that's really what we focused on. But in future work, we certainly could extend this to add-ons, and that may change the sort of perspective here somewhat.
Yeah, to be honest, I agree, and it's you have to start from somewhere, and I'm sympathetic, and I appreciate actually your reasoning around it. So I will ask you a couple of other questions which are somewhat related to this point, but slightly different angle. Talking about potential bias and how you addressed it. In one answer to Yaxing, I believe you said, and I'm trying to remember close to verbatim, but I may not be exactly precise, that you didn't find evidence of the browser influencing preferences. Assuming I am correct in my memory. What about the other causal direction, different preferences affecting the choice of browser users make in real life, and therefore your subjects using different browsers being essentially very different subjects in terms one for the other? So how did you deal, I know we discussed it, right? But how did you eventually deal with this subject heterogeneity, which may impact the results? Is it just a limitation of the study, or you accounted for that in some ways?
Yeah, so I want to be very precise about what it was that I was alluding to there. So this is not a result of the first study, which again was qualitative in nature. This was a result of the second study, which was quantitative in nature, though we also did have qualitative findings as well. And what we collected, in addition to people's preferences to allow or restrict the different data practices across different websites, in the demographic survey, we also collected what is your most commonly used browser, right? And so what we did not see there was a statistically significant evidence to reject the null hypothesis that the preferences did not vary essentially based on which browser people gave us as their primary browser. But that is a potential limitation rather than a definitive statistical conclusion. Why is this? Because the proportion of market share of the browsers is heavily skewed towards Chrome. In fact, more than 80% of our respondents to that second study were Chrome users. And so rather than saying that, we conclude that browser doesn't make a difference here. Rather, it should be more precisely stated that we cannot conclude whether browsers make a difference here. It is entirely possible that it does, but qualitatively speaking, there wasn't really users during the qualitative first study that suggested, oh yes, I use this specific browser because I wanted to manage this specific setting. More often than not, what we saw with things like Safari was, oh, I trust Apple, so I use Safari. Or, oh, you know, I'm a Chrome user, so, you know, it's the browser that I've always used. Or, you know, a friend of mine told me about Brave, so that's why I use it. So again, we can't generalize from this. We absolutely can't. And if you wanted to do a study where we tried to measure the correlation between browser preference and preference to allow or deny these practices, we would have to do a different study where we collected a stratified sample, but that's not what we did here.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense, and it leads me then to the last question, yeah, which is once again it is about study one, but in a way it's about trying to go back in time to a discussion I know you had with Norman, with all the research team, and I would like you to revisit this discussion now that you have completed a study to see whether your reasoning has evolved or stays the same. When you were thinking about how to design study one, if I remember correctly, you were considering a purely quote-unquote objective approach. So no user study, simply cataloging, making a catalog of the settings, how many clicks it takes to arrive to a setting, etc., versus this more user-oriented approach, right? And you opted for the latter, which absolutely makes sense. And you did so because you were considering the different design trade-offs of one approach versus the other. Looking back, how are you thinking about those trade-offs now? Have you learned something new about the trade-offs of going for a objective quantification of the different settings, the clicks necessary to reach them, versus the trade-offs of going for a self-report, user-oriented study?
Yeah, absolutely. And that is a very interesting question in retrospect. But I think that if there's one conclusion of the study that I would like to sort of really focus on, it's the fact that, you know, there is a lot of problems that even, you know, users that were apparently tech savvy had with browsers that we thought that they weren't going to have as much problems with as they did, right? So I had this sort of initial, perhaps quite biased perception before we'd settled on the design for the study that, oh yeah, you know, of course, Firefox and Brave users are going to have an easier time of figuring this stuff out because, you know, they've got all these settings right in front of them to just use, and then they'll use them and it'll be fine. But the reality is that these settings are not useful just based on the fact that they can potentially control things. People have to understand the settings in order to make any semblance of effective usage of them. And if they can't understand the settings and they can't understand the relationship between the settings and their desired outcome, or if they can't understand whether the chosen setting, even if it is the correct setting, you know, based on the model that's incorporated in the browser, but if they can't, you know, rely on the fact that they can be confident that the setting works, then it really kind of throws out the window whether the settings are doing their job at all. Because if people don't trust that the browser does what it is that it's saying that it does, then the choice is less meaningful. And so I think that you really, really cannot divorce the user from the settings and the ability to use them. It's crucial that these studies incorporate an aspect of usability. Otherwise, we're really not going to get any really meaningful insights here. And so I'm very glad that we didn't focus only on whether people could objectively, you know, allow or block the setting or not, because that ambiguity is what makes it a really tough nut to crack.
Very nice. Very nice. Thank you, Daniel.
Thank you very much.
Norman, back to you.
Norman, you're muted.
So somebody wanted to be unmuted. I'm not sure who that was, but anyways. So are there questions from people who are not on the committee?
If you'd like to ask a question in the audience, just go ahead and raise your hand.
And then we can unmute you. And it's okay if nobody has any questions. Okay, I don't see any hand risen. So maybe I should ask you at least one question. This question is, I don't know how it's going to come, whether it's going to be a comment or a question, but let me just get to it. So this is chapter 2, and your recommendation that there be a standard and perhaps some regulation. I've got 2 questions / comments on that. One is there any reason, I'll formulate this as a question then. The first one is there any reason why, even if you were to have defaults by categories, you would not want to allow users to potentially still have the ability to toggle things on a website by website basis?
No, there really isn't a reason to do that. But I think the question is, if that setting, or the way that that setting is offered, is perceived to override, the sort of more general settings about categories of websites, then people could easily be intimidated by this and then not bother to use the category level settings. So I think it's very, very careful. It's very important to be careful about how these settings are offered. It's not necessary to sort of take away people's ability to customize these websites to website. But the way that these settings are portrayed, allowing both of these things to happen, is really important.
So there should be a very easy way to reconcile the two, right? I mean, you could have these category settings. You could have, save defaults for them. And then users would still have the ability to override them on a side-by-side basis. And if they do, you could always have a question along, at that point in time, asking them whether they would want to change the corresponding, default for that entire category.
Absolutely, yes.
I think that would be probably a pretty easy way to deal with that. So this leads me to the next question here. And I don't know, again, if it's going to be a question or a comment at the end. Maybe it's a bit more of a comment. But it seems to me that there would be some value in perhaps articulating a bit more how this regulation that you're potentially suggesting would really work. Example, right? Who is going to decide what the categories are? And there are 2 sides to this. One is to decide, what the category should be, and the other one would be to decide which category does this website fall under. For instance, if some categories have more permissive settings, some people might try very hard to present their website as if they fell under the more permissive category. Some websites might very well fall under multiple categories. And so I think it would help if you try to spell things out a bit more. And the reason why I'm suggesting this, and I guess it's more comment than a question at this point, is that if you don't spell it out, people will use the argument that I've just made to push back against that. On the other hand, if you show that there is actually a way of, doing this in practice, then it will be harder for people to push back.
Yeah, well, allow me to remark briefly on that. So, while going more deeply into the regulation that I'm proposing wasn't something that I had time for during the actual talk, in the final chapter of the dissertation, this is something that I do address, at least to some extent. But I want to point out that it's not possible for us to know right now precisely what this best categorization scheme is, and we need to do more research to figure that out. So while I propose that a regulation of this sort may be necessary, and this is citing often, work, for example, such as what Alessandro has done to show that, this regulation may be necessary in order to make sure that people have the ability to express their choice. We don't know precisely what this regulation should look like. I can just say now, though, that there are examples out there of what the regulation probably shouldn't look like. So for instance, very technology agnostic regulations such as GDPR may help, but it may not go far enough to ensure that websites are required to actually provide these choices in a way that's automated, right? There's nothing in GDPR that says, websites should have an API such that browsers can talk to them and then enforce their preferences. The other issue as well is that there isn't any regulation saying that people can offer this API, but if people choose to use it, then their site can just break. That was one of the things that I did touch on. So I think that if regulation is to be created, it has to be mindful of all of these considerations and more, which is that there may be other contextual factors here that we have not had the opportunity to study that need to be baked into these regulations. So we've got to do more research before we rush headlong into building these standards and APIs. it's just quite clear that these are probably going to be necessary.
Right. Okay. I hear what you're saying, and I'm happy to follow up with you, out of band on this. I've got a few additional thoughts on this, but at this point, I'd like to give people perhaps a final chance to ask any additional questions they might have. Rebecca is back, so perhaps she had some other questions. And if she says no, then I think this is the time, and I don't see anyone raising their hands. So it sounds like we've reached the time here where we're going to ask people who are not on the committee, including you, Danielle, to leave us. Danielle, I think I do have a phone number for you.
Yep.
So I can ask you to, come back when we're ready for you. Let me double check that I do. Phone number.
Yeah, at this time, that also means that I'm going to shut down the live stream and the recording.
That would be, from a privacy standpoint, a good idea.
Yeah, so thank you to everyone who attended through YouTube. Take care, and I'll let you know the results as I know them.